This video is a brief look at how unitary governments have a habit of micromanaging their army, and specifically their army's individual battalions. I will mention 3 cases, and there will be a close examination of a recent example of these cases. Before addressing our 3 cases, let's establish what is meant by both federalism and unitary government. I'm taking these definitions from McCormick, Haig, and Harrop's Comparative Government and Politics, 12th edition. Broadly speaking, federalism is to be understood as a firm separation between legislative, executive, and judicial power, coupled with strong checks and balances of each of these powers on the other powers. A unitary government is said to be any government that does not fully implement this separation of powers. This is the official chart showing the organization of the offices of the Pentagon, freely available on Wikipedia and many other locations on the internet. I like this chart, however, there's a lot going on here, so let's simplify. Here's a simplification. Notice how clearly the lines are drawn. As this chart starts with the president, we, the reader, know that we are under the umbrella of executive authority. One of the functions of the Pentagon and its staff is to assist the legislature when it exercises its authority to check the executive. Outside the Pentagon, we see the 4-star area commands that provide focus, support, and executive accountability to the missions in those individual regions of the world. These area commands are part of a public and direct chain of accountability open to the checks and balances from the legislature or the judiciary. On a bit of a side note, I'd like to mention Mission Command. Mission Command is a new idea in the military. However, suffice it to say that it is a further refinement on the very federalist ideal of public accountability. The important point here is that in a properly administered federalist system, the military is originating its own operations orders. The military itself has control of the tempo and the sustainment of operations. It took me a while to find this chart, and I don't feel that this chart is that helpful. It certainly doesn't help anyone attempting to track the flow of an operations order. Here's my attempt at simplifying the previous chart with an eye towards following the path the operations are ordered. A few things to point out. 1. Despite the underlying committee structure, the path for military orders is frighteningly direct. 2. The senior civilian leaders of the military organization are exercising both legislative and executive authority. All the civilian ministers are also members of parliament or are a lord. In our example, this confusion of legislative and executive powers creates serious issues down the military chain. In particular, this organizational structure unduly weighs itself upon the battalion commander level of the military. Initially examining these 3 battles, one could be forgiven for asking if they have any commonality at all. My own separate readings and studies of these battles brought about a dawning realization. Despite the widely differing so-called standard narratives of these battles, there's a strong thread of organizational desperation. The organization, or should we say the lack of organization, behind these 3 engagements is stark. Both Cowpens and Bronkhorst Spruit have a decided lack of artillery support. The Battle of Goose Green, while retaining both artillery and air support, the battle was still largely lacking in fire support, and had the Argentinians been even marginally better motivated, Goose Green surely would have been a defeat. As it was still a close-run thing, the Argentinians managing to save some face despite themselves. Let's take a closer look at Goose Green. Here is a brief list of the serious problems that befell the ad hoc, hurried operation at Goose Green. I think it's best at this point to read some quotes at length from Brigadier Julian Thompson's book, No Picnic. The radio telephone was as clear as if the call had been coming from next door. As clear and unequivocal were the orders from Northwood. The Goose Green operation was to be remounted, and more action was required all round. Plainly, the people at the back end were getting restless. I returned to my headquarters and summoned Jones. Chester informed me that the only way that the brigade could go anywhere other than 4-2 commandos moved to Mount Kent was on foot. It had become quite clear to 3 Commando Brigade that, apart from the wholehearted support from the Royal Navy, the brigade was on its own. No assistance or support of any kind would be forthcoming from anyone, either close at hand or back home. It was, as they say in the French Foreign Legion, a case of demeure de toi legionnaire. Jones was told to carry out the raid on Darwin and Goose Green using the same plan that had been agreed before. He was updated on the intelligence available to the brigade at the time. It gave the assessment of the enemy's strengths in Darwin and Goose Green as 2 companies of 12th Infantry Regiment, 1 company of 25th Infantry Regiment, a platoon of 8th Infantry Regiment, and possibly an amphibious platoon. The guns were assessed as possibly 2 105mm howitzers, up to 6 35mm anti-aircraft guns, or 30mm anti-aircraft guns, and up to 6 20mm anti-aircraft guns. There was also estimated to be 1 platoon of engineers and 1 support helicopter. Jones then went on board Intrepid to see the SAS squadron that had attacked Darwin on D-Day, and they told him that, in their opinion, the whole isthmus was held by about 1 company. After further discussions with Holroyd Smith, Jones returned to his battalion to brief them for the forthcoming operation. The patrols were, however, spotted and forced to withdraw under fire. At about midday, someone in the battalion tuned in to the BBC's World Service and heard the announcements that 2 Para were advancing on Darwin, while 4-5 Commando and 3 Para were advancing on Douglas Settlement and Teal Inlet Settlement, respectively. Jones was furious and ordered the battalion to disperse and dig in to face the attack that must surely follow this gross breach of security. However, no attack came, and despite the alertness of the enemy at Darwin, who had forced the withdrawal of C Company patrols, the Argentinians mounted a highly unprofessional vehicle patrol in a blue civilian Land Rover up the track at Camilla Creek House. They were jumped by the FAC control party returning from controlling the Harrier strike, who allowed the vehicle to close their position and captured all 3 occupants before they could radio back to base. Interrogation by Bell, who had been sent to accompany the battalion, revealed that the officer in the party was the commander of the Argentine reconnaissance platoon and that the garrison was fully alert. Some days after the battle, a prisoner admitted to General Moore that the garrison had been reinforced using part of the strategic or mobile reserve carried in helicopters from the Mount Kent area at the very short notice when the Argentines had been alerted by the BBC World Service broadcast. These conditions under which Brigadier Thompson labored are what I would describe as allo deployment. Under these conditions, the military is not allowed to pick its own strategy, and essentially you have the highest military authority, naturally, in the modern world, a civilian, micromanaging individual battalion deployment. The general ranks, as proved by the Falklands War, are little more than detailers or facilitators, and not actual strategists. Brigadier Thompson could have been a colonel, and it fundamentally would not have made any difference. The whole management of the Falklands War, like the many British wars before it, was ad hoc and essentially marched battalions and battalion commanders into improperly prepared situations.